Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be hunting down the true, highly structural birthplace of tech innovation. We are basically stripping away decades of popular folklore to find the absolute root of the modern startup ecosystem. We want to find the real engine that powers the global technology hub we all know today. So, I want to ask you a question. Where was Silicon Valley actually born? If you're into tech history, you probably picture a small, dusty garage, maybe a famous coin toss to decide whose name goes first on the company sign. It's a fantastic myth, for sure, but the real origin story? It's much older, and honestly, far more strategic.
The prevailing myth dictates that the high-tech ecosystem was born in 1939 inside a tiny garage on Addison Avenue by Bill Hewitt and Dave Packard. Now, that HP garage is a vital physical symbol of entrepreneurial grit, absolutely. But it represents a continuation, not the actual origin of the region's structural architecture. The reality? Well, the reality is the 1909 Federal Telegraph Company. 30 full years before HP ever plugged in their drill press, a 25-year-old Stanford graduate named Cyril Elwell walked the dirt tracks of Palo Alto with a radical proposition. He wanted to build a commercial empire based entirely on the invisible manipulation of high-frequency electromagnetic waves.
Let's move to Section 1 and see how this builds. Securing the Danish patent. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive technical crisis that was crippling early wireless communication. You see, the dominant technology of the time was the Marconi spark gap, and it was violent, it was wide bandwidth, and super noisy. Because it relied on these episodic, literal electrical sparks, it was pretty much limited to basic Morse code. You couldn't send the human voice cleanly at all. But a radical alternative existed, patented by a Danish inventor named Valdemar Poulsen, the Poulsen arc. By burning an electrical arc inside a cooled hydrogen atmosphere wrapped in a magnetic field, it created a continuous, unbroken wave. It was tunable, it was clear over vast distances, and it was the absolute holy grail of telecommunications. Recognizing this massive market vacuum, Elwell traveled to Denmark in the spring of 1909 and executed what we'd now call a classic modern startup move. He secured an IP moat. He didn't just buy the hardware. No, he negotiated an exclusive multi-million-dollar contract for absolute patent rights across the entire United States territory. He was essentially commoditizing an abstract piece of global physics into a proprietary intellectual property lock. All right, moving right along to Section 2, the first academic VC syndicate. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Elwell handled the terrifying financial bottleneck every deep tech founder faces. He had the patent lock, right? But he had zero liquid capital to manufacture the massive iron arcs and towers he needed. And traditional West Coast banks? Well, they were built on asset-backed lending for logging and mining. They viewed investing in invisible radio waves as total financial madness. So he bypassed them entirely. He marched right into Stanford University and pitched its legendary founding president, David Starr Jordan, not as an academic mentor, but as an angel investor. He extracted personal seed capital from their elite networks and, in October 1909, formed the Federal Telegraph Company. He basically invented the university-backed venture capital syndicate, directly tethering Stanford's academic credibility to the high-stakes equity valuation of a local startup. Which brings us to Section 3, inside the Emerson Street Lab. With the patent secured and that Stanford syndicate funding cleared, Elwell established his primary engineering facility in 913 Emerson Street in downtown Palo Alto. Inside this unassuming wooden building, the Emerson reactor, if you will, he engineered a culture completely counter to the rigid, hierarchical corporate models of the East Coast. He literally vaporized the barriers between academic theory and manual craftsmanship. He put theoretical mathematicians shoulder to shoulder with machinists who were winding giant copper electromagnets. He systematically rated Stanford for top engineering talent, pulling brilliant minds right off campus. And the focus was entirely on rapid commercial R&D. To grasp just how revolutionary this lab was, listen to this story. Elwell recruited an embattled inventor named Lee DeForest who had developed a primitive vacuum tube called the Audion. Inside the Emerson Street Lab in 1912, DeForest and the FTC engineers hooked up 3 of these tubes in a cascade. To test if it could exponentially amplify sound, DeForest placed a live housefly on a piece of paper right in front of a microphone. The cascaded tubes amplified the sound until the fly's footsteps vibrated through the laboratory like marching combat boots. It's wild to think about, but this monumental discovery, the actual invention of the electronic amplifier, happened right there, establishing the physical baseline for radio, radar, television, and eventually the digital computer processor. Let's jump into Section 4, Scaling for Global War.
Every infrastructure company eventually has to prove it can scale past localized experiments, right? You have to monopolize global networks. For the FTC, that meant conquering a whopping 2,100 miles of open Pacific Ocean to bypass the expensive underwater telegraph cables controlled by monopolies. By 1910, FTC crews had built twin 300-foot wireless towers in South San Francisco and Honolulu, Hawaii. Traditional radio engineers actually scoffed at this. They predicted the system would fail against the immense atmospheric distortion. But when they threw the switch, the continuous pulse and arc performed flawlessly. The Honolulu station cleanly received the data streams with unprecedented speed. It was an absolute triumph of global system engineering.
And then came an even bigger scaling event, 1000. When World War I erupted, the United States government suddenly realized that national security depended entirely on secure, long-range wireless communications that enemy submarines couldn't just sever. So the U.S. Navy looked directly to Palo Alto. They poured millions into the FTC, transforming it into a vital military manufacturing complex. The lab rapidly scaled up to build giant 1,000-kilowatt transmitters weighing hundreds of tons. Deployed globally, this proved the region was no longer just an agricultural outpost. It was a high-capacity defense manufacturing superpower. And finally, Section 5, the modern AI parallel. So, the crucial point is, if we strip away the historical aesthetics of copper wires, iron towers, and antique radio sparks, something truly fascinating emerges. When you line up the 1909 FTC loop directly against the 2026 AI loop, they are literally running the exact same playbook. Look at it. Elwell went to Denmark for an exclusive lock on the pulse and arc. Today, AI companies are spending billions to lock down foundational LLM logic. Elwell systematically drained Stanford engineering talent. Today, AI startups raid the Stanford AI lab for top PhD researchers. And just as the FTC scaled through WWI maritime defense contracts, modern automation giants scaled through massive Department of Defense intelligence contracts. The technology has evolved, but the structural highway remains completely identical.
Which brings us to our core thesis, the enduring Palo Alto crucible. The engine of Silicon Valley is automated, it's repeatable, and it is over a century old. Cyril Elwell took the radical step of linking academic prestige, raw intellectual property exclusivity, and high-stakes corporate equity risk into a single, self-reinforcing engine. By placing a university at the absolute nucleus of a commercial startup network, he built an economy capable of continuous regeneration. Whether it's vacuum tubes or deep learning algorithms, the structural pipeline remains untouched. So I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. What century-old blueprint is your industry secretly running on? We love to think of modern innovation as completely unprecedented, but the deepest, most powerful structures of our economy are often just highly polished versions of a foundational architecture built long ago. Keep exploring, keep digging into the history of your own field. You might just find your own Cyril Elwell hiding in the foundations. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.